I was purchased a piano to learn to play, which I never did learn to play, when I was 7 years old, so just over 50 years. And I gradually got more and more into it when I left university, and then even more when I've retired.
You're listening to Finding Pieces, a podcast on pianos, people, and music. Welcome to Finding Pieces. We're in Season 1 on piano rolls. In this episode, we have our third and final guest of the season, Julian Dyer. Amongst the many ways in which Julian is involved with player pianos, he is foremost known in the player piano world as a roll historian and a roll scanning expert. I'm really excited to share with you our conversations here today. In the first half of the episode, we talked about Julian's involvement with the player piano group, having been a long-standing member and a journal editor. Then we talked a little bit about the kinds of music that Julian likes to play and listen to on piano rolls. In the second half of the episode, Julian shares his thought on the current state of roll scanning, digitisation, and emulation. At the end of the episode, you'll also get to see his scanner and a roll-making machine. So, let's begin. You were involved with the player piano group for a very long time, and what is this mysterious player piano group?
Well, the player piano group was founded by Frank Holland, who founded this museum. It coalesced from a series of friends that used to meet Frank. On a Monday, some people would come. On a Tuesday, other people would come. And gradually, as he got to know more people, they started to meet each other. They formed what they call the player piano group. So although we say that Frank Holland founded it, in fact, it founded itself around Frank Holland.
And when was this?
1959.
1959. And were they all, would you say, professionals at player pianos, or were they just purely
Absolutely nobody was a professional. When all this founded, Gordon Isles of Turner Pianos, he was still making rolls using the Aeolian perforation equipment. One of the enthusiasts who got involved very early on was a guy called Gerald Sternhill, who found a dual art piano in his house, and he got very into this. And he then realised that Gordon Isles was actually cutting dual art rolls. They all got together and made copies of rolls, which at the time was quite novel because nobody was doing this. Rolls were not being recut. The Palmer brothers were running automatic player piano actions in Southall. They had actually worked at the Aeolian factory. And they were still working in the 1950s. They worked until the late 60s or into the 70s. So there were people, they weren't pianola restorers. They were the last remaining people involved from the original production. And so the player piano group was founded early enough to gather the last remaining professionals.
Experts that still know how these instruments worked or how these rolls were being made.
Yes. The player piano group was for people mostly who had had pianolas in the 1950s, probably been brought up with them in the 1930s or 20s. There was also people who were carrying on the traditional interests of classical music being made through the pianola, not the dual art automatically, but through playing the pianola. It was founded probably with 20 or 30 people by the early 1960s. The player piano group gradually grew, and it probably peaked at about 600 members about 25 or 30 years ago.
Wow.
It's now dropped down to about 200 members.
That's still quite a lot.
I joined when I was 21, when I left university. By the time I was about 30, I was editing the magazine.
Oh, wow.
Partly because I had a computer.
And you were one of the younger members, I would suspect, at that time.
So I found myself editing this magazine with 40 or 48 pages to fill. Small pages, 85 pages, 4 times a year. And had to just learn how to produce a bulletin, learn how to research the stuff, and just scrape around as best you could. But the player piano group was always a social society, so it had a meeting once a month through the year, so about 11 or 12 meetings a year. You go to people's houses, listen to rolls, a bit of music, a bit of chat, but it was mostly social evenings.
Yes, and did you attend all these social gatherings of...
Yes, you go to what ones you could. Depends where they were, of course, in the country. What happened with the player piano group, Frank Holland was not very good at sharing. He had to be in control, and obviously was based in London. When he moved to London, he was based on Hanger Lane. So the people who would meet up at his house were naturally from West London. Separate associations were founded because the player piano group wouldn't hold meetings elsewhere. So we ended up with a Northwest Player Piano Association. There's also the Player Piano Association of Wales and the Southwest.
And what would normally happen at these gatherings? Would there be a concert, or is it like a meeting to talk about how you scan rolls or how you make rolls?
So there were social meetings. So you would typically meet at about 3 or 3:30, have a cup of tea. Then it was quite normal to play maybe half an hour of rolls.
And someone would be at the pianola operating the rolls themselves.
Well, to be up to the host. Sometimes you might have a garden party. We went to Gerald Stoneshall's house, which was in the Boltons in West London. This enormous house, big piano. You got Gerald to play you a formal concert with a program. He would introduce the rolls. He would decide what was going to be played. He would play the stuff. There'd be interval. Then you'd have the second half. And then everybody got up and left as quickly as they could. Other places you went to would be a party. So Reg Richings, just up the road at Ealing Broadway, he would have a roll party. He would ask people to play some formal music where you were expected to listen to the music. You didn't talk over the music, you listened to the music. Once you'd had that hour or something, then it was talk. After which, what you might call open pianola.
And did you play at any of these
Oh,
occasions?
of course, yes. Well, the first time I went to one, I hadn't any idea how to play the pianola. I had my own one, but I was just a youngster with a not terribly well working pianola we'd had for years. And you get to play a good pianola, and they're more airtight, and they just run away with you. So rather than playing like a pianist would play, you end up playing something frantically loud, and it runs away with you. You can't control it. It's like trying to drive a sports car you don't know how to drive. Then you listen to other people play, you think, well, that's interesting, and you try to emulate what they've done. How have they done it? You get taught how individuals who've put a lot of work into this. There are some people who regard the pianola as a very serious way of personal music making. This has always been the British approach to the pianola. Go to America, that's never been the approach. The American Society, Amica, they don't play the pianola as a serious musical instrument to the same extent. They play automated music. It's a bit more like you might see here in the museum where the demonstrator just puts one machine on, puts another machine on. Here's a polyphon, here's a musical box, here's an orchestrion, here's an organ. It isn't like going to a gentleman's private music recital in their home, which I think is where the PPG started. Over this last 5, probably 10, if not 15 years, to be honest, the social meetings of the player piano group have faded away, and we're now really down to only seeing a small number a year. The hobby has definitely thinned down, largely speaking because British houses are not big enough to fit player pianos into.
Yes, they're even discarding pianos now for keyboards.
So how many grand pianolas do you have in your flat?
I have one grand piano. That's about as much as I can take, actually. My neighbor came down the other day and said, we recently purchased our flat, but the previous owner left us this grand piano that's 100 years old. Would you like to have a look at it and maybe buy it for a few £1,000? And even though my research is on 19th century pianos and it would be an interest to me, I actually have no space for it. So it's a pity, really. So at these gatherings where you go around and then you share your pianola works, what was one role that do you always take around one role that you particularly wanted to share, or do you change around with your roles?
It was more common you just take yourself along and you look on the host's shelves for what music they have, and you're examining the music they're offering.
What would you say was one of the most surprising role or one of the most delightful findings?
So the player piano meetings were quite interesting. They varied. One of my good friends in the very early days was a guy called John Wotton, and he liked 1920s and 30s dance music. And I started by collecting 78 records of British dance bands. So I came into the player piano group having familiarity with dance music. Well, the majority of the people who founded the player piano group would have held this music in absolute contempt. They never listened to it. They were playing serious classical music. But I liked dance music and jazz. We'd have the meeting at John's house. Everybody would leave, maybe 8:30, 9 o'clock. I would stay there. We would talk. We would play dance music until the early hours.
Yeah.
And he was so pleased to meet somebody who actually liked dance music.
I wanted to ask you for recommendations of your favorite dance. Or...
So the music that I perhaps found the most interesting was a jazz pianist called James P. Johnson. When I was 10 or something and starting to learn these things, I borrowed records from Woodford Library, and things were played on the radio, and I would record things off the radio when you had a cassette recorder. And I had this fantastic piece of music. I now know the thing which fascinated me, I had no idea it was a pianola, was Caprice Rag by James P. Johnson. In the 1990s, a guy called Rob Deland started to recut rolls blues tone. At that time, it was difficult to buy rolls from America because there was no PayPal. So you had to go and get a banker's draft from Thomas Cook. It cost you £25. And you had to go up to London to get it, and it was just ridiculous. And I used to join together with friends. We used to buy a box of maybe 70 rolls to share between us. And I actually bought all of the James P. Johnson rolls which were available, and I have them all on my shelf. And a few years ago, somebody I got to know very well in America, a guy called John Motter Ross, he gave me an original copy of Caprice Rag.
Wow.
The roll which I'd heard before I even knew about the pianola.
Wow.
So that I suppose had to be my touchstone piece of music. Manufactured by the Standard Music Company, Orange, New Jersey. So what you've got here is, I think this is 1916. Hand played. It's called a rag, but it's not a rag. There's nothing ragtime about it. This is stride piano. And James P. Johnson recorded this for more than one firm.
We're back. Yes. So you talked a little bit about how you would take the role and perform it, and how would you approach a piece of music on a role? Would you say that you would prepare the music in advance, or would you let the role reveal the music to you, so to speak?
Well, it obviously depends on the role. If it's a dance role or a metrical or jazz role, you're really listening to the rhythms and you're really working out where does the stresses lie. Whilst if it's something like a Granados piece, you're looking where should the rubato go, where does the melody line go, how does the theme work. If I'm really serious about it, I might even go and mark the roll up from the sheet music, but that's not my background. I tend not to approach music like that. If I play a thing and can't quite get it right, I might then go and listen to a recording and think, oh, there's something more to it than you first got.
So you're keen to take music on kind of the recording level, and I know that you have a website in which you scan rolls, piano rolls, and make it available digitally in terms of recording and output that so that other people can access it. Do you want to talk a little bit
Yes,
about
well, there's two aspects to that. If the music has been arranged from sheet music, a roll has been arranged from sheet music, it needs to have the correct tempo and also rubato. Now, you can't put in full rubato into a roll because the relationship of the left and right hands is fixed. It's cut into the music. But you can put in the overall tempo, you can put in the pauses, accelerations, and you can also put in the overall shape of the dynamics. If you're playing timpanelli music and you happen to know where the words lie, you can try to stress the music as if you're singing it. The best timpanelli songs are written with the stress line on the turning points, on the high notes. So they go up to the stress and down again. The less good timpanelli stuff didn't match the musical stress to the vocal stress. Mm-hmm. And that was part of the art of good songwriting. A Gershwin song would always have all the accents lying on the turning points. Mm-hmm. So musically, it's obvious where the phrasing lies. And the simplest piano rolls to play these are the QRS rolls done by Lawrence Cook. Lawrence Cook would have played around with the length of notes to make them sound right. So if he's playing a foxtrot, you will see that the stressed notes have got slightly longer slots than the unstressed ones. So if you do nothing, you get slightly longer notes, and those longer notes sound like they've been more stressed. It's agogic accent, and it's actually psychoacoustics in the modern terms, like how you can strip noise out of an MP3 file without noticing. Once you look at the well-edited rolls, you realise how much work the editors put into it. You look at older rolls, they hadn't really thought this through. So you get a lot of the older themedist type of rolls. They're actually harder to play because they're not really being laid out in a pianistic manner.
So you started observing these different patterns of these different makes of piano rolls and learning information about the way that pianists or the way that the editors do certain things with the piano rolls. And would you say that you've put all that knowledge in building a digitization scanner?
You could argue that digitization, which is the art of just really photocopying the roll, and it's got nothing whatsoever to do with playing the roll. It's almost like the antithesis of playing the roll, because a scanned roll has no input from a pianolist at all. This is a big challenge for roll scanning. Quite a lot of the modern day archives, like for instance some of the ones in Spain, which have been doing some very assiduous scanning of their material, those rolls, although they're cleverly arranged, they were designed to be played with a pianolist doing the kind of things I was just saying. If you're playing Albanith, you need to know where the accents lie. And if you try to listen to, let's say, Alessia de la Rocha playing Albanith, you realise that all of these little micro pauses, it's so complicated what she's doing with her rubato, and it is virtually impossible to do with a roll, even if you try hard. But if you don't try at all hard, then you get this terrible flat mechanical thing, and it sounds no better than street piano, you know? I personally use digitization as a way of storing away the contents of the roll so that we can make a replica of that roll. Because I make rolls, I have a small machine to make rolls.
And you don't do the emulation side of the process?
Now, if you think about sheet music, some years ago, there was a lot of noise made about the Sibelius editor, because these youngsters who had written it had put in some simple rules to put in the stresses. So if Sibelius played you the music, if it would look at the musical time, and it would actually if it was a waltz, it would try to put the stresses in the right place on the beat. Probably just done by rote, but it was clever. Nobody has done that yet with digitized rolls, which are then played back. They're always played back with no expression and no rubato.
MIDI. It would be pure MIDI.
Well, that's just, but it's not. MIDI can of course put in all of that. You can put in both tempo changes and dynamic changes, but it can't get them from the roll because the roll has no tempo changes and no dynamic changes in it, unless of course it's a reproducing roll. In which case you can write a simulator where you're trying to tell the MIDI how the pianola, the duo art or the ampico or the royalty, would respond to the controls in the roll. But at this point, you're not in music at all. You're in physical, mathematical simulation. And so you're purely in the land of the mathematician and the physicist.
So you're not quite in the land of mathematical and physicists. You're still very much in the hand-playing role, and you
they all have their place, and they all have some positive thing, but they can be abused. And this is a concern, I think, with a lot of people about the digitised roles simply played back without the necessary tempo variation and without the necessary dynamic variation. And of course, a pianist would play colorations in all the chords, which a pianola can't quite do. Good role might have tried to, say, use this psychoacoustics to convince you that coloration had been put into the chords, even though actually there is none. It's been done by playing with timing. Perhaps Lawrence Cook and Frank Milne, you could argue, the two best at this, although there are others. And piano rolls are cut from sheet music. So typically they wouldn't put all of that timing nuance that was supposed to be put in by the pianolist until you went into hand-played rolls, which is later. If you digitise an arranged roll, you lose or never put in the things which should be put in. So these archives of digitised 88-note rolls are really a perversion. It's exactly what the roll was not supposed to sound like. So scanning a roll is a technical means to create a new copy of the roll, which then can be performed as the roll was meant to be. So it's a way of taking a damaged old roll or a rare roll and making a new copy in good paper. If it's a dual art or an Ampico reproducing piano, then you can write a simulator to do in MIDI what the piano would do with pneumatics. Performing a roll and scanning a roll are really, they're almost antithetical.
And how accurate would you get to scanning the roll to its original?
Well, if you get a well-cut roll which has not been damaged, a scanned roll will be 100% accurate. It's a digital copy.
Like a photograph, just photocopy it.
Well, it's more than that. It is more like copying a CD or a digital card on your camera. You can copy it and it's a perfect copy. It isn't an approximation or a near copy. It is an exact copy. Every one is a one, every zero is a zero.
Yeah. And what if you have rolls that are damaged?
At this
point... Where the complication begins.
Well, there's all sorts of ways in manufacturing rolls that things could go wrong. A roll could be poorly mastered in the first place. In other words, the roll is simply not a good representation of the underlying music. There could be errors in the perforation. The perforator might not have been working properly. The paper being moved through the perforator might not have moved constantly. Because they go punch, step. But when they move the paper forward, it is pulled by this tractor. But they can have an off-centre, an eccentricity to them, and you can see that on rolls, that you get two copies of the same roll, put one on top of the other, they go in and out of phase of each other. If you scan the roll, you're making an assumption that the steps are exactly even. But the rolls were not actually quite even. And it depends on how your software works as to whether you can cope with this variation in the underlying grid. And at this point, you're getting into like master's image processing technology. You really are. It is quite seriously complicated.
So the best possible solution is to try and get different copies of the same roll.
That's right.
And compare.
Yes.
And see how close or how...
That's right. And then, because, that's right. The other thing which can go wrong, so the rolls can be mastered incorrectly. That's quite rare. They can be cut with a degree of slop, and that's quite common. They can be damaged after being made. Water, they can get wet, they can get torn, they can get stressed, so what should be a single chord has become pulled apart because a bridge is broken. And then, of course, all you've done is you've photocopied the roll. You've got a black and white or an image of the roll. You might not process it properly, or the damage in the roll might not be the kind of damage which your software can cope with. And then what I find is that you end up with a dance roll. Dance rolls are always cut with a fixed number of perforation steps per beat, very typically 24 punch rows per beat. What you can do with it, you remaster your roll, you run it through the software, you put it into an editor, and you can overlay bar lines effectively, where you put a line across the roll every 24 steps. If you get a well remastered roll, you'll find that you line it up to, typically do it to the off beats on, let's say, on a foxtrot. You will suddenly see that one of them is now a punch row different. And there's been a slippage. You've actually missed one of the rows in your processing. If you do that, you can then look in your editor, you can then add back the row. It's what you really can do in MIDI, you can quantize, and effectively you can do it by eye. Yeah. And you can actually have a look at the perforation bridging patterns, because you know that it rolls a punch, typically miss 2 punches and punch, that creates a bridge. If you see that there's a bridge missing, you know you've actually lost a punch. You can guess that you've lost one, because you have to assume that the roll was cut properly in the first place. Sometimes they didn't cut them properly. To actually get a good digital copy requires a degree of understanding how rolls were made, and it can take a ridiculously long time.
So obviously this is a very meticulous task, yes. And it is also can be very tedious as well because it's quite repetitive. What do you think is the ultimate purpose that it's leading to, besides preserving the rolls in order for it to be circulated? What are we trying to get to here? Is it an understanding of this era that made the rolls?
I think that the drive to digitise rolls came with the domestic availability of the disclavier, which is a modern solenoid version of the pianola, and is capable of playing very well. So people end up purchasing a disclavier and wanting it to hear their favourite piano rolls on it. They wanted to consume the roll in a different medium, so they actually created a digital version of the roll. No, I've never bothered with that. I don't have a disclavier. I have my house is full of pneumatic pianos. So my interest is to make accurate copies of the rolls, which is to say a copy of the roll which is identically the same as the original roll, a digital copy of the roll. So if you were to throw away the original roll, you would actually have the copy is just as good as the original roll. There's no loss.
I mean, there is that ultimate, what you said about passing from one medium to another medium, which, you know, we sustain resources in order for it to pass on to the next generation and still have it being available to play, whether that still is in the same medium as how we had it in our generation. And that automation, the element of playing something pneumatically or digitally, electronically, to don't know what impulses, new electrons.
Well, what we do know is that player pianos are getting older. It's quite possible that the majority of existing pneumatic player pianos will cease to be operable within some years. And we know how many are being scrapped at the moment. And you can look back in history. Culture has a certain time that it looks back. You can see that the challenge for the player piano world, if the number of player pianos that are working is dropping away, but there are other means of either a disclavier or equivalent modern pianos, or simply computers playing through a synthesizer. So as a way, if there is music that you wish to preserve from the piano world, scanning helps it. It shouldn't hinder it. So either you can make new paper rolls or you can listen to them. If they're simply arranged rolls without expression,
someone still needs to play it.
Exactly, yes, right. So,
someone needs to interpret it.
Yeah. So you hope that with all preservation, you preserve something in order to preserve it, not in order to dictate what is done with the preserved item. Because you can't control that. You have no idea in 50 or 100 years' time, if you successfully manage to maintain the preservation, which is a big if, what will be done with it. If you look 50 years back and look at what were the projections of what now would be like, they all look silly. It is a bit like, as my dad always used to say, and many people say, planting an acorn is an expression of faith in the future.
Yeah.
And you could argue that scanning and all preservation is, so this is worth preserving for the future, whatever that future will be.
Yes.
And you're not either controlling the future or predicting the future.
No, you're simply using the knowledge you have now to pass this on to
It
the
is
next
how
step.
it's how humans go. So you could argue it is, in the end, it is faith. Like a lot of stuff, you're driven by the technology, the fun of making a scanner, mathematical computing to actually interpret this information and do something with it, and an interest in preserving the history in there. Because obviously one of the aspects of the producing piano is those roles do have a performance embedded in them. And I think that we are seeing the current interest in the hobby is in looking at historical performance styles. So I gather that there is a degree of dissatisfaction with modern clinical piano playing, which is where effectively you actually want a pianist to almost play like a pianola, like with the beat exactly correct, everything precisely right. Listen to these old performers, they were very free and easy with their interpretations. You might find something to inspire you in the future.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Julian. And Julian has a website in which you can purchase his digitized rolls. So do look out for that. And it was really nice chatting to you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.